So what I'm going to talk today about is the idea of story architecture and what that effectively means to me. I've considered myself a filmmaker for a long period of time, but I don't feel like the term is relevant necessarily to me anymore. And I'm going to share why, and I'm also going to share some of the things that my company and I have been doing, which is in the vein of story architecture. And basically what I want to kind of get across is some interesting new ways to look at the design of stories, how they can travel across multiple platforms, how they can engage audiences, and thus, further the discovery of the work. So, if we think about it, entertainment, started as there was always this kind of collective water cooler type of moment, where people would see something and they would know, and there was not very many outlets. And in this particular example, it's kind of looking at the three networks that were in the United States primarily, and kind of looking at those and saying, okay, somebody would watch an episode of something and they'd be able to talk about it because there'd be some collective experience there. But today, it's a lot more difficult. We live in a world that is literally totally fragmented. It's an on-demand culture. It is very much about a competition for people's time. And so when you're kind of looking at the design of work, you're kind of up against quite a bit. I mean, I love films in a cinema, but in the times that I've spent taking time to recognize what the audience is doing or the consumption of the media that they have, it starts to open up all these additional possibilities. So at the same time that this is happening, we're experiencing something where we're having kind of a dropping in the value of content. Everything's becoming fluid. It's ones and zeros, and it's easy to get in a situation where you're kind of losing what essentially was that value proposition to begin with. Like, if you make work, how do you actually benefit from it? How do you actually make money from it? If the acquisition prices are dropping, if everything is so fluid, if there's so much competition, how do you actively really embrace an audience? How do you actually sustain as a storyteller? So that combined with the idea that there are these multiple outlets, and when I think about outlets, what classically used to be either just a television experience or maybe a cinema, you start to get a mix of these variety of things, like social networks, messaging channels, gaming, mobile apps, real-world events, theatrical experiences, and television. And you realize that people are consuming their media across these variety of outlets, but they're doing it in a way that's personalized, there's customization in them, and there's this desire to, well, I guess effectively you could say that everybody is now their own media company. People can easily push button publish, get things out to the world. Whether people are watching or not is a different story. So if you're kind of looking at that, how can you effectively tell engaging stories? When I look at these particular outlets, I think about having a beginning, middle, and end to each of the stories I tell across them. It's kind of like having an overarching story that I want to tell, and then thinking about the most effective ways to deliver it. And what I mean by that is, in the instance of having something that maybe is a feature-length work, and let's just say it's 90 minutes long, there's going to be a lot of things that live outside of what I put on the screen. There's going to be things that deal with additional stuff that never made it in, characters that I cut out. There might be additional dialogue scenes that I got rid of. So there's stuff that's originated right from the beginning of the process. And then there's the ability to kind of leave it open for the audience to come in and extend that as well. So when I think about these outlets, I think about them in terms of like, okay, if they have the individual arc, and then I have the overall arc of the full story, and it becomes about how I pace it, how I get it to an audience, and how I have them interact with it. So story architecture, to me, is kind of the idea of what effectively is a kind of a fluidness of creative technology in terms of how you actually deliver these things. How do you scale them? How do you get them to these various outlets? How do you make it an experience that somebody's going to be engaged by and want to continue to, hopefully tell somebody else about? And then business, like the last part is kind of entrepreneurial. How do you actually derive new revenue streams from this? How do you actually look at it in a meaningful way so it's impactful for yourself? When I start to break down the script, we work from the written word. So we're either working from a script, we're working from a game Bible, a show Bible, we're working from a novel. And what we'll do is not too dissimilar to how an AD will break down a script, towards locations or characters or props. We'll go through and we'll look at it and we'll say, okay, where are the hooks out of this? Where are the ways that we could potentially deliver certain aspects of it? What kind of data can we collect along the way? And so in this particular instance, we're demonstrating just kind of a story sequence where there's a split in terms of time. So one thing, just to kind of give an example, is a current project which I actually pitched here last year, which was called Him. I'll give you an example of how this pertains. In terms of Him, I looked at it and I said, okay, there's a timeline for this story, and the timeline consists of, effectively, if I look at it in the design of the story, it's kind of a little bit of Lord of the Flies meets 28 Days Later meets Logan's Run, So there's a lot more to it, but I condensed it because I have a little bit of time. So basically, it starts with this timeline where these outbreaks that are happening globally. And looking at those outbreaks happening globally, I started thinking about, okay, if they're global outbreaks, why don't I drop them into each territory that I want to shoot in and let the people in those territories take them, very similar to how a television format works, thus opening up the potential for either co-production funds or innovation funds, or just literally helping to get more people interested in those works in those territories. So kind of looking at that and saying, okay, well, that's the outbreak. So that happens at one point within the timeline of the story. The story progresses, and the grid goes black, because the storyline is kind of very much about this sleep virus. All the adults get it. They start to get crazy. They start to abduct children, and it becomes this mess, and the youth are left with this world where they have to try to figure out what to do. Well, when that happens, everything goes black. So then there's a whole bunch that takes place in there where I can play with the idea of hidden things and the game elements and whatnot. And then on the other side of it comes, the presence of an isolated incident within this world. If this is happening globally, where can I drop in and effectively have the story take over? So the feature film property, in this particular instance, is one of those isolated events, and it tells a story there. And then what happens is the timeline extends off the back, and it goes into what happens, in terms of both in these other places globally, and there's a whole kind of thought process to the arc of it. It's not just necessarily released in the beginning as a way to drive people towards a theatrical. It's actually there with an underlying game element to take them all the way through. So that being said, looking at it and saying, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of when you get into the script? And in this particular instance, there are certain triggers that we'll find, and sometimes I'll find them as a way to kind of they're kind of an inspirational extension. In this particular instance, I'm describing something that's like a broken window, and this would relate to a Paris story that we had. So like where I said that we dropped them into different territories, imagine that one of them is France. This outbreak is happening in France, and basically what we have here and what I'm going to describe is kind of like the notation and then looking at it from a technical perspective and saying, okay, how do we scale this and how do we actually put this out into the audience? So in this particular instance, there's kind of an event that happens that creates a riot in Paris. That results in this PBD thing, just stands for a phone browser daemon. And what that basically means is we have a server that initiates an emergency broadcast. So at that point, it goes out and it calls all the different people who happen to be a part of call level 12, which is the level 12 players. And at the same time, it triggers kind of a widget environment that starts to push across the broadcast as well. And then what we have is just the idea that, at a certain point, these callers are then bridged together, and they start talking to each other through like conference lines. So we actually bridge the call for them and loop them into these groups. And then what they find comes back into the game, and at the same time, we're unlocking the level. So basically, in a nutshell, It's kind of looking and saying, okay, we have this way to tell a story, right? We have these serialized episodes that are showing something, and then we get to a point where somebody's engaged and they're receiving some type of mobile communication. Those mobile communications open themselves up to the idea of unlocking certain media. So in this particular instance, we would look at something, so when the riots actually broke out, you'd have a scenario where there was things related to coordinates, and you would have stuff that would ignite itself off of, you know, in particular, this instance, it would be like some riot footage or something along those lines. But the point being that with the element of kind of collecting this data, you know, whether it be the players contributing back, user-generated elements, one of the things that I really honestly believe in the future that's going to be valuable to everybody who sits in this room is the way that you can understand the data that is put together around your projects and how you can harness that to be able to, you know, be able to better enable people to be able to discover what you're making and to be able to tell a story more effectively. So, like for instance, if we go through that and we had that element of where, okay, you see the creative that we have that we're laying out, when we design, it's kind of designed towards the idea of a story and the audience, and in the center sits this story world gateway, right? So we have these creative decisions that we make. We have these interactions, which can be interactions by the people who are participating, and then we have events that we do. They could be real-world events. They could be a variety of different things. So one thing that's important to talk about is when you're kind of thinking about the type of audience you have. Christy earlier mentioned them as casual, I forget the middle, but then enthusiastic. We look at them as kind of watchers, players, and agents, and basically within this parameter, you know, the watchers are kind of a casual audience. The players are a little more engaged, and then the agents are people who actually start to change and contribute back to the actual storyline of what we do. I think in terms of the creative design element of it, or looking at it, and the reason I think you have to start to think about the audience is, and I raised this question, are we getting to a point where, when I was talking about the fluidness of ones and zeros, I was talking about the dropping value of content, are we moving closer to, you know, some type of a service model around the work that we make? You know, and I mean that in the sense of, is it really about creating social interactions? I've seen it in my own work where I've put stuff together that maybe constitutes of 30% of somebody's time is engaged in the content, where 70% of their time is engaged in social interaction. So if that's the case, are we actually moving towards models that are more service-oriented, you know, more in terms of creating value for the audience and the people and the connections that we make? And that raises some really interesting questions, because where do you find potentially new revenue models for that? You know, where do you find a way to kind of harvest that? And that's why the data becomes valuable. And in my opinion, we start to look at something where, as the audience can contribute back, as we push the story, we start to have different types of story and production metadata that we push into that. And then we have performance data that comes out the other side. You know, we live in this real-time connected world. The ability to harness, and from the stuff that I've seen, when I can see data and know how an audience is interacting with the work, I can change it up, I can serve it better, I can customize it, and I can unleash and have it ebb and flow in ways where I'm able to kind of tie, you know, almost like open up a valve or something. You know, it's like routing it. And so that's why I think when I'm saying story architecture, it's like thinking about those implementations as well. You know, yes, it's powered by the creative, but then it's also the idea of how you're using and visualizing this data that you get, right? So if I look and I say, okay, well, where are these revenues going to come from? You know, I think in some ways the gaming world has some really interesting things that they're already doing. You know, they have things about achievements. They have people that will pay for certain types of avatars and status. They have, you know, a variety of really interesting kind of gaming achievements that people are willing to pay for. So why can't we take some of those same things and apply them to storytelling? Why can't we take some of those same aspects and apply them to the idea of story worlds? So that being said, you know, one of the other core elements that, you know, Halo 3 has, for instance, is a replay feature. You know, so you can go through, you can play with all your friends, and then you can literally go back and replay it and watch from all the different angles that you want. It can be customized to your play. The other person can see what you were seeing at whatever particular time. And I think what's interesting is with transmedia, there's been this fragmentation that I talk about in terms of the audience share, this fragmentation in terms of what is the experience, where do I go? With television, with film, you know what it is, you know what's on the other side of it. The problem that we have right now in this interim time is how to bridge that. You know, what does that look like? So the reason I bring up the gaming side is I really do think that there's room for taking some of those applications and bringing it into storytelling. Now, some of the things that we work with is if you have a story and you're dealing with a much longer period of time or you're trying to pace it, and you kind of put it out there and the story moves across, and I lay out all those different things about the different outlets, well, they're all splintered. How does anybody know that it's happening or existing? So some of the stuff that we've been working on is a way to have story detection across devices. So if you start and you're watching something and you happen to be engaging in it and it's online, and then later you're out and you're doing something and you maybe can engage it over your phone. At that point, when you go to engage over your phone, it's going to know where you left off, and it's also going to put you in touch with the other people who are playing the experience at the same time or who are engaged in the story at the same time. I think that's a really valid point because what this basically is saying, there's a level of this story detection across devices, right? So it's kind of like, okay, how is that then formatted and given to the audience? So in one particular instance, you could be looking at something that could be taken out to an iPhone, so then you would know who else was engaged, what friends you had that were playing at the same time or engaged in the world at the same time. It could make its way to what effectively is a story world gateway concept, where this could be on the television, this could be in the living room, this could be on a mobile device, as I said. And what you have is this idea of how you're using the data in effective ways. So that being said, like what's important to note is if you're looking at it, all this is related to coordinates, it's related to data, it's related to APIs, which are application protocol interfaces, like Twitter down the one side, you know, could be incorporated in a variety of ways. You know, map data is basic, you know, you can bring it in, re-represent it. But the idea is that we want to kind of move both in terms of the way we design and we look at it is like how can we engage the audience and give them a common experience? So if we have some type of a gateway that allows them to do that, we're moving it towards some degree of a collected kind of experience. That being said, once you have the data, and that's the reason I keep harping on it, you can kind of put it anywhere you want. You can use it in any way you want. You can repurpose it in a variety of ways. And you kind of move it towards this idea of, you know, effectively a story world that can be harnessed in a number of different ways. So, for instance, in this particular view, you can see what effectively we would have is the whole different story world that you could navigate. And what's important to note is this can be unlocked and used in a way that when you can see what your friends are doing within it, you can replay it in a way that you want to. You can replay different story paths with it. You can replay different ways that people went through it. You can increase all these types of discovery methods. And I think what some of this is maybe a little future looking, but the idea that once you start to harness this data, you can start to put it into a concept of a media social graph. And once you start to do that, you can have these situations where it becomes easier to discover multiple bits of content. You know, like there's this, I believe, kind of a fallacy of the long tail. You know, in the current infrastructure, I don't think your film is going to, you know, it's great that there's virtual shelf space for it, but the reality of somebody finding it are slim to none. You know, what transmedia offers is the ability to extend the life of a particular project and create that value, so over the course of time, it's more likely that somebody will find it. But I leave you with this one thing. You know, if the content that we are making is decreasing in value, what is the value proposition? You know, what is it going to be that creates the sustainability for us? And I think it's looking and figuring out how to harvest some of these new potential business models or these new methods. And some of it might seem a degree overwhelming in terms of the amount of work that you have to do already. But some of these things that I outlay can be adapted all the way throughout the production process, all the way through to the point where the audience is actually assisting and contributing back to it, and then could be repurposed and used and licensed in a variety of ways. Once you have the data, and it is the future of everything. You know, if we look and we say search was the future, you know, a number of years back, it really is about discovery. It really is about filtering. And a lot of this discussion throughout the day, throughout this whole thing is, you know, the conference is going to be about how do people discover and find you in a world that is swelling with content. So I think, you know, some of these things and what I call story architecture and how I feel that I've moved away from one particular medium, I think, you know, there are things within that model that I think can be learned, you know, from other industries, you know. So, thank you. I think, do I have any time to answer? Okay. I can answer someone's question if anybody has a question. Somebody must have one. Yes, there's a couple of them.
Hi. It's a general question which pertains to your presentation and a lot of what we've heard today. What of the strategies and schemes that we've heard about seem to appeal to the hardcore? Mm-hmm. What are the strategies for appealing to the casual consumer or casual user or the sort of engaged but not hardcore user? What do you think those are going forward for cultural industries?
I think it's really quite simple. I think it's just about the connections between people. You know, and I think if you go back to the three types of audience types that I described, you have this ability where you're going to have, you know, hardcore users. It's a matter of how you harness them and use them effectively and collaborate with them. I mean, I think the big thing here is that authorship is changing and that the audience is effectively now not only a contributor but also a collaborator with you. So I think it's really in the social aspect. I think it's the value proposition is make obviously engaging stories, but then make ways that you can bring people together. And one particular instance is we ran a game, an alternate reality game, and when we looked at it, you know, we had people that were spending about 20 hours a week on it, on average, anywhere between 8 to 20 hours a week. That's a lot of time. And in that particular instance, two people met each other and ended up getting engaged and getting married. Now, that particular aspect, that's a social connection, you know, obviously. So I think, you know, when you can look at it and you can say, oh, okay, well, there's a game element, and that becomes like a certain type of audience. At the end, it's about pervasive stories. You know, it's just about increasing like the outlets of where they go and how you use them. So I think in the core of that is really the social aspect. One more, I think. Whoever has the mic can hand it to whoever they like.
Lance, when you are starting to construct your story architecture around a 90-minute narrative, but you have, you know, avatars within ARGs that are playing out in a larger story world, when you start building those things, do you have quite a consistent idea in your head in terms of the story world, which may take 20 days or 20 hours for someone to complete, of a linear beginning and end that they can then play out in their own time?
You're asking if we design it in a linear fashion?
If you, before you design it, when you're just in concept stage, when it's just an idea, whether the idea has a beginning and an end, because all these are just tools to explore stories in different ways.
Correct.
So do you have a consistent beginning and end?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is like what normally started with like a 3-act structure and a screenplay. In the case of some of the work that we've been developing, it starts with like kind of the build of a universe Bible, a game Bible, a show Bible, where we kind of go through and define the world, define the interactions, define the characters, define the rules. And then from there, it becomes this amazing kind of depth of information where you know more about the subject than you ever did before. So, and then that constantly is kind of informing each other, you know, and then we'll do things where we kind of let it out into the world and create kind of an R&D scenario where we'll let people try different things and kind of test it. But I think when I'm doing it, it really comes down to one simple thing. It's trying to put people in the shoes of the protagonist in some particular way. You know, let them see through the eyes of that character, you know, whether it's a small character looking at a big world story or whatever it is, but building it from that perspective. And I think when we do that, you know, you're always trying to build effective characters, compelling drama, tension, whatever it is, mystery, you know, questions. We're always looking at that and saying, what's the question that pushes us forward? You know, how do we move through this thing? And then I think the other thing that's really important is looking at it and saying, okay, pacing. How do we pace this? You know, where you say 20 hours, 20 days, you know, 20 months. You know, we look at it and we say, okay, here's the design of this. You know, here's the story that we want to tell. Here's how we're going to technically implement this. And then these things inform the amount of flow, the amount of staffing, the budget, the way that we kind of look at it. So there's a very calculated kind of path for it. And a lot of it fits directly in current production standards. You know, because at the end of the day, you have to kind of adapt with what's still there. And then some of it embraces interactive standards and other things that are going on. So thank you. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Thank you very much.